Hello, this is Zeal, and welcome to another episode of Gaming Keystones. In today's episode, I'm going to be going over repetition. It's actually a really important part of games. In fact, I'd say it's one of the most challenging aspects of a game to perfect. I often find myself only having fun with games for a little while, yet other times I don't want to stop playing a game even after playing it for hours. The polarity is jarring, and I think it's kind of crazy, especially since I play games all the time. As an outsider, many people may think that since games are similar, there's very little reason to pick up a new one. There are some genres and styles that can be easily replicated, and this can lead to far less differentiation between two games in a genre. However, repetition in gaming is not a negative thing. In fact, it's one of the main reasons some games thrive. In today's episode, I'm going to dive deep into repetition and uncover how some games can use it to their benefit. The first thing I want to bring up is repetition in story. There are many games that don't do this well. As we mentioned in our video on devotion, too little deviation in story content will make it tedious and mundane to get through. The same thing applies to the theming in a story. Without those distinct ideas and concepts, the world-building elements blend, especially in story-focused titles. However, everybody knows that storytelling will be tedious when it's overly repetitive. Featuring dialogue expressly explaining the same thing over and over again is not fun. However, repetition is. Much like any real novel, the ideas in a dialogue should be connected. It's one of the first places repetition comes in. Without repeatedly hammering in the same topics, the narrative should incorporate a similar sentiment throughout the game. It could be something simple like the consistent triumph of Shovel Knight after completing a boss, or even the apathy that the board has about soldier deaths in Hive Jump. These small homages to different themes and ideas are fun, but not because they require a lot of devotion or explanation. The reason they work so well is that they have such a minimal barrier to entry. Even without reading a single line of dialogue, it's immediately apparent that Shovel Knight is happy when he completes a level. He does a little dance and thrusts his sword in the air. It's obvious. Similarly, in Hive Jump, they explain how insignificant lives are in just one sentence. It doesn't take away from the gameplay, it just reinforces these themes that they're building up over time. Repetition works well in these scenarios because the ideas are not complicated to understand, and the developers recognize that. Thus, they don't spend a lot of time explaining it. Story content doesn't feel repetitive when it's to the point, even when it occurs frequently. However, this can often change based on how frequently an action is performed. For example, if every time I took out an enemy Shovel Knight did his little dance, it would not be so cute anymore. I find that even simple animations often do a lot to enhance my experience. The repetition reinforces the defining characteristics of my favorite characters. Unfortunately, it's not always positive. If it's overly abundant, it can get in the way of the things that I want to do. This is prevalent in Animal Crossing New Horizons. The game kills its pacing when I have to craft things. Undoubtedly, the developers put a lot of effort and thought into the villagers' crafting animation, and I think it looks adorable. However, it's overly time consuming, and I don't want to watch it over and over again when I craft things. I think the developers of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate truly understood this principle. They wanted to make their grappler character, Incineroar, expressive and detailed. Thus, with most powerful moves, like a true wrestling champion, he taunts and berates his opponent. It's simple, and while it's not overly long, it's incredibly abundant. It would be challenging to survive if I had to watch every single taunt all the way through, and thus the developers allowed me to cancel the taunt and move freely. This way, when I had time to spare, I could taunt my opponent and show the expression that Incineroar is known for. However, when I needed to follow up with a different attack or get ready to dodge, I could do so easily and without waiting. It's an excellent balance. It's kind of easy to see the repetition challenges resolved when the actions can be cancelled. However, repetition also enhances a game when it's used on seemingly insignificant yet significant things. Point-and-click adventure titles often impress me with how minor information can expand into something that solves an entire puzzle. Unforeseen Incidents does an excellent job at repeating information pretty much exactly the correct number of times. In this game, dialogue and story information are imperative to solving puzzles. This meant that the story was important to pay attention to. Thus, since I was paying close attention to the dialogue, I would have noticed easily if they repeated the same information too much. The writers cleverly worked around this. While they still emphasized concepts near puzzles that required certain information, they spaced out the times they would be talking about certain concepts. Moreover, just like in Signs of the Sojourner, each character is distinct. So despite paying a lot of attention to the writing, I never felt like it was boring, despite literally recalling important information all the time. Additionally, the story utilizes the show don't tell philosophy. While there are a lot of things that are just plain laid out, many things have to be interpreted, and I didn't receive the full story until the end of the game. The way the developers, and specifically the writers of Unforeseen Incidents, utilized this repetition made me almost feel empowered, as I got to decipher different elements of the story as time went on. It felt nostalgic, like homages, because the game had plenty of different ideas moving around. The important thing here is that games can use the same ideas and repetition to enhance their game as long as they bolster it with other ideas too. Then, instead of being boring, they are a pleasant reminder of what the past was. Games with a focus on story can utilize repetition to make their narratives and character design more powerful, even if they have to be careful with it. However, where repetition is truly apparent when it is required or recommended is in the gameplay. I think back on times I experienced repetition and remember the dread I felt searching every block in a Metroidvania for a hidden item or repeating earlier parts of a level to get new attempts at boss fights. These examples show exactly how mundane and tedious repetition can be in games. For example, I did not like going back through stages in Hive Jump. The game is similar to a roguelike, so when I died, I needed to repeat a lot of the progress that I just completed. However, unlike a traditional roguelike, there's very little differentiating each attempt. For example, the enemies, themes, and bosses are all practically identical, and it wore on me over time. The exact opposite thing happens in other roguelikes. Since there's a lot of variety in the levels, weapon loadouts, and enemy combinations, it's not challenging to find new experiences in every playthrough. This keeps games like The Walking Vegetables interesting even after multiple playthroughs. However, I think this idea has been covered a million times already. Obviously, games will stagnate if I don't feel anything different when I play them multiple times. Thus, instead of being excited about playing them again, I'll feel dread. It makes me sad to say this, especially because many things I hate to re-experience are things like world building or traversing through normal stages. It's weird to find myself getting frustrated attempting to progress through something that I had initially appreciated. However, I cannot deny that it happens. Whether the boss fight has me walking from too far away upon death, or needed to repeatedly attempt a stage to get through it flawlessly, I hate the feeling that comes with repetition. Despite that, and despite countless examples I've seen of repetition hindering a game, I still think repetition is crucial to making a successful and long-lasting game. The games that do a good job utilizing repetition in their gameplay feature a lot of the same techniques as those who use it well in their story. For example, I still really enjoy homages. Seeing major boss fights turned into minor enemies when my gear and technical skill improve is super clever, and I appreciate this tangible improvement in my abilities. Similarly, I enjoy revisiting old locations, even if just briefly, to see how much better and more capable I've become. This works in almost any type of game. However, an important distinction is that when revisiting old locales, I should be able to improve my experience there. Whether through new gear, an upgraded skill level, or new scenarios, for a game to truly captivate me using repetition, I want to experience the pre-existing content in a new way. This makes me think of games like A Robot Named Fight, which simultaneously improve my attacking capabilities while opening gates that at one point would have initially impeded my progress. This meant that when I backtracked to new areas, I took out enemies quickly and potentially leveraged new skills and upgrades along the way. It's simple in concept, but it's still fun. It helps provide a safe space to understand new mechanics while revisiting those areas and making them more fun and rewarding. Using repetition in this way helps make the game more digestible, especially when some games constantly introduce new mechanics. More importantly though, it allows me to experience that old content with a new weapon. It also reminds me of Pokemon. In the beginning of the game, I constantly get berated by wild Pokemon and other frustrations when I try to get from point A to point B. However, as time progresses and I complete battles, I get money from defeating trainers. This means that as I progress further into the game, I can purchase items. One such item is called a repel. The repel keeps me from getting attacked by wild Pokemon, therefore rewarding my progress by making revisiting old areas easier. The effect is even compounded because the repel works better and more effectively when the Pokemon I have are higher leveled than the Pokemon around me. This works well, and it eliminates the tedium that is associated with revisiting the same enemies. It's a great example of allowing someone to revisit an old part of their adventure without bogging them down with unnecessary easy fights. However, this works because Pokemon requires travel to these locations for the story. The way it adds interest is through the new experience that comes with understanding just that little bit more of the lore. I also enjoy repetition when it shows my growth without forcing me to revisit any area I've encountered. Shovel Knight does a good job at this, by having me face off against every one of the bosses that I've faced up to that point in one of the later levels. It was a lot of fun, and I appreciated how competent the game made me feel. It worked well, and represented my skill nicely. However, it only worked so well because there was a foundation of interesting and unique experiences. Plus, it made the fight feel different because there were greater stakes. If I failed, I would need to recomplete all the fighters that I just fought. This meant that I needed to play differently, and couldn't play as brazenly. I had to act with care and caution. And this was different than my initial more fast-paced strategy, and I enjoyed the satisfaction that came with the new experience of my level. The repetition featured in Robot Named Fight, Pokemon, and Shovel Knight are really cool, and the repetition actually enhances the experience. However, there are actually some more blatant ways to incorporate it. Games somehow occasionally make me re-experience the same exact part of the game in a different way. It's a perplexing phenomenon, because every experience I played through in other games would make me assume that this is not fun. But this is just not the case. I was blown away by Bot Gaiden, that really took this idea to heart. It's an action platforming game featuring a robot trying to get through various stages, kind of like Mega Man. But where this differs is that it pushed me to complete each stage as quickly as possible. When I complete a stage quickly, I unlock a new upgrade for my character. This meant that I could traverse tricky situations, but without rushing through them, it would be challenging to unlock all the upgrades that would help me on my journey. So to get these upgrades, I replayed the same level multiple times. However, what made Bot Gaiden so special is that it pushed me to complete the other levels first, so I could unlock upgrades and then come back to old levels. Once I got those upgrades and skills, I was able to push my time even further, and reap even more rewards from that initial level. It met all three of the above characteristics, and provided extrinsic motivation by making my character better for improving my time. The repetition of the game actually defined it, and I liked it a lot. On the other side of the spectrum is Penko Park. It's a game like Pokemon Snap, where I went relatively linearly through an environment and tried to take pictures of animals in my way. Over time, I collect new upgrades that allow me to interact differently with my surroundings. For example, I can unlock a ball to throw at creatures, and that leads to different varying effects. It's clever, and it keeps me coming back for more, as repeating the same areas leads to different results. It shines even brighter because the game gave me other upgrades that allowed me to alter my travel speed, so I could speed up or slow down when I want to. The game design once again honed in on the feeling of repetition. This meant that any new discovery I made felt exciting or rewarding, even if they're not groundbreaking differences. I continually saw tangible improvements in how I could interact with the environment. I think another reason why repetition worked well in these games is that the repetition was specifically identifiable. What I mean by this is that the repetition is not treated as though I was progressing through future parts of the game. Each example is of me revisiting an old area with a new objective. While in a Robot Named Fight, it was required that I went to that direction to proceed, it doesn't feel like a new area until that new area is opened. Pokemon features new dialogue, battles, and story in the same areas. Even revisiting stages in Bot Gaiden and Penko Park, I knew that the developers don't consider it the primary way to progress in the game. Still, I wanted to explore more in each location, even after I'd unlocked the next level. It felt good to repeat things when I could alter the experience. The one exception was that combination of boss fights in Shovel Knight. While each boss fight was the same, they formed a greater entity once combined. It actually made it more challenging and did truly force my mastery and did lead to progression. However, it's a different type of repetition. In a sense, repetition is required to make the game feel identifiable. It's hard to recognize growth if the game world or game concepts change. This is especially significant with games that require a lot of investment. I expect my games to be consistent, even when there are new mechanics. Don't get me wrong, I think games are more fun when there are consistent influxes of new mechanics. However, each one should be consistent with other parts of the game. It's not all too hard to see where this is present. Think about water levels in Super Mario Bros. Wii. The game is designed to be casual and light. Thus, the game doesn't have a limit to how much time you can spend in the water. It's a simple thing, but the vibe of the game represents how the game should be played. When games swing wildly from easy to challenging or fail to repeat the themes present, it loses its identity, and I become less attached to it. The first example of this is easy to understand. It relates to difficulty curves, and more importantly, when difficulty curves are jarring. This happens all the time, and it's incredibly frustrating to get immersed in a game world where the levels are significantly easier or more difficult than prior levels. This was prevalent in the Tarnishing of Juxtia, and I was incredibly disappointed by how much of a cakewalk it was to get through many of the later levels. Even the bosses didn't require I pay attention. The lack of consistency and repetition was incredibly detrimental to my experience in the game. The same thing goes for the opposite. I don't like sudden spikes in difficulty. To me, it makes the game far less tolerable than if the game was consistently challenging or consistently easy. Again, here, repetition is key. The final part of repetition comes in the gameplay loop. Often, final bosses are the most significant and important tests for games. However, the reason they feel so significant is that they represent the final challenge of the game. The final challenge is what I've been putting in all my hours for, and this is what I tried to achieve. However, it's really disappointing when the final boss doesn't represent the skills I needed to use to get there. This happened to me in the Serpent Rogue. The game focuses on collecting and crafting different materials, such as weapons or potions to use on enemies. It has a lot of cool mechanics, such as a strict inventory limit and intense combat sequences. However, the final boss, the part of the game that should sum up my entire experience, featured none of that. While I will not go into details, I will say that I was disappointed, and that the lack of repetition, the failure of the game to test my skills that I'd come to master, left me underwhelmed. Overall, I think repetition is a dangerous thing to mess around with. With too much of it, the game will easily stagnate, and there won't be any reason to continue onwards. However, without enough of it, growth while playing will be muted. It's a fine line to cross, but not something that people should immediately consider to be a bad thing. In fact, it leads to a lot of excellent game ideas. Thank you so much for watching.